So this section, so 25 minutes, 30 minutes to look at a product that we haven't highlighted or shown to you guys from a cloud field day, tech field day point of view. Yeah, it's been around for quite a bit. I'm not going to sit in slides really at all, apart from talking about the components that we have. And really, it's going to be focusing around Veeam backup for Microsoft Office 365 and how we do it, and also the ways in which you can do it. So to begin with, I'm Michael Cade. I'm a senior global technologist at Veeam. Yeah, let's jump straight into some demo. So first of all, I've got my Azure account. Now I'm going to use Azure and I'm going to deploy it from a marketplace. If you have a look, I've got nothing in my resource group apart from an IP address, because I didn't necessarily want to air a public IP address and password and all that sort of thing to you lovely people out on the internet. So to begin with, if we have a look at the marketplace options that we have for Veeam, and I look at this quite regularly, but there's a number of appliance models that we have out there. You see the things that David just touched on around Veeam backup for AWS, but also Veeam backup Veeam backup and replication version 10. The one today that I want to get on with is the Veeam backup for Microsoft Office 365. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to deploy a Windows 2019 box with the latest version of VBO, a fresh copy of that. Now, that's not the only way. We also have it over in the AWS Marketplace, and you can roll your own Windows 2019 box. And I've got some deployment options that I'll share when we get back into the couple of slides that I've got. So if we get going and we just start this simple, this is nothing really that exciting, if you will. Anyone that's deployed something from a marketplace, they generally have a very similar look and feel. So if we give this a name of CFD. Now, obviously, if this was going to be your production copy of data that you're going to start, or copy of VBO that you're going to start protecting your Office 365 components or objects, then you're probably going to put some infrastructure redundancy around that. For the purpose of the demo, I'm not going to do that. I just need to remember that my username is Azure user, and I'm going to put that password in there, and I'm just going to open the RDP port. Obviously, again, from a security point of view, you're probably going to tie this down a lot more in a real world scenario, but for the sake of a demo, we're going to choose the default disk options. We're going to choose that CFD IP address that I've already created, and that's the only change we're going to make to that network. All the monitoring we're going to keep the same. Again, I don't want to actually show a Azure Marketplace demo. The important thing, I think, David touched on it, both for AWS and Azure, is the ability to add your tags. Obviously, anyone that's been through this has seen this. So we could add a backup tag here, and we can start picking up that machine within our backups, a summary, and then we'll get that created. And then I'll run through what the component or what the architecture looks like on just with a couple of slides. So let's kick that off. I just want to see that starting up there in that top right corner. Good stuff. Okay, so as I said, this is not a new product for us. We are on the verge of coming out with a version 5, but there's quite a timeline that we have, and we've had that since November 2016. So fingers crossed that we actually get to 2021, and then we'll have it'll be 4 years old, this product. So when we first brought out the product for Veeam backup for Office 365, it was initially just for Exchange Online. It allowed us to protect Exchange Online into direct attached storage, into a SAN-based model, using a JetBlue database. I'm going to touch on the components as well. Then, as you can see through, I'm not going to touch on every milestone here, but version 2 was a significant release because that's where we started protecting things like OneDrive for Business as well as SharePoint Online. And you can see all the way through this, there's performance, there's scalability, there's RESTful API enhancements, all the way through. If we touch on version 4, though, this is probably another significant release, is the ability to directly back up into object storage. And that doesn't need to just be Microsoft Azure Blob Storage. That could be any S3 compatible. It could be AWS S3. It could be IBM. And again, I'll touch on that. And coming next is the version 5, which will give us the ability to protect teams. And I've got a preview of a tech preview build that I can show of that. So I mentioned around deployment. So deployment-wise, I'm using the Microsoft Azure. Hopefully you can see that. My picture's over the top. So you're right. So Microsoft Azure from the marketplace, very simple, next. Obviously, there's some security and some configuration that you might want to do if you're rolling this into production. Also from the AWS marketplace, a big shout out to one of our Veeam vanguards, Maurice, who created a Chocolatey package to be able to get your Windows, or you get your Windows 2019 or 2012 box and everything in between. You spin that up and then you run your Choco install VBO and it will go and install a standard installation of VBO for you. And there's also Terraform scripts out there, and there's another shout out to that later on as we go through. But another key point that I want to kind of just shout about here is that it's a very, very small download. Like, yes, we talk about all these automated deployments, and really what I wanted to show was how simple it is to deploy and get something up and running and start protecting your Office 365 environment. But really for something less than 32 meg, and you're going to see what that product looks like shortly, and that can be downloaded as a standalone download. You install it on your Windows server on premises as a vSphere VM, as a physical machine, and all of the options are there. It's really about being flexible at that point as well. Okay, so componentry, and that is actually a word. I have a Wikipedia page to prove it. The first point is, well, what can we protect? And this is today, this is based on today, so you won't see that Teams construct or those objects in there yet, but just imagine that being there as well. But many of the customers or prospects that have moved to Office 365, they might also have that on-premises footprint as well. So what we did, we had to look at that challenge, and we wanted to create a backup software that was able to protect the hybrid approach to Mail, to SharePoint, and to OneDrive. So this is where the first component comes in, the VBO server. Now this can be deployed as an all-in-one server, so it's going to contain your console, it's going to contain your management. So think about this as the brains, all the backup jobs, the configuration, the schedule, etc. But then also the proxy, and I'll get onto what that is. But for the purpose of that demo, I'm just deploying one machine that's going to do it all for us, but it's scalable out to larger environments as well. So then we have how do we access that, or how could we give a third party or an integration into that? So we also have a console. So we've created our own console to be able to manipulate, and that's what we're mostly going to be using today in the demo. But then there's also a full RESTful API, and you might have seen that on the reverse roadmap, as well as PowerShell. I'm going to leverage some of that PowerShell to actually spin up and start that from the ground up, day zero type deployment. I mentioned around the proxy. So this is our muscles. This is going to move the data from A to B, or from Office 365 to wherever we wish that to go. And they're completely scalable as well. Up to 10,000 objects per. And if we think about an object within Office 365 as a mail item, as a file within OneDrive, etc., they're your objects, and that's how you size accordingly. I'm not going to go too much. I haven't got enough time to go into the like a deep dive into the architecture. This is just really a 40,000 foot view of what this product looks like. I'll give a shout out to Tim Smith. He did a really good presentation at Veeam a couple of weeks ago, where he does go into the weeds around what and how you size this. So then we have the local repository. So this could be where this was pre-version 4, where we'd store that data or store that backup in a JetBlue database or a Jet database, and we'd store it in there with all of the characteristics of that Jet database that has been used, obviously, in Office 365 as well. Now, each proxy is aligned to one of those repositories, but in version 4, which is where we're seeing a massive uptick of where people are wanting to store their SaaS-based backups, is object storage. And I already mentioned the four key areas, because obviously S3 compatible can be anything that is S3 compatible. So what this allows us to do is store locally on that DAS SAN is just a small percentage. I think it's around 1% from a sizing perspective of the metadata and cache, things like the attributes, so the to and from, dates, modified dates, created dates, etc. We're going to keep them locally, and then we're going to offload everything else into into object storage. So, but we're also in that object storage, we're going to send the metadata and cache as well. So if we did lose any of that chunk in the middle, then we've still got a copy of that data in our object storage, wherever that you choose that to be. The benefit here is not only are we offloading to potentially cheaper storage, and also now we're opening up the door to a bit more portability in terms of being able to move that management server wherever we want that to be, as long as it's got access to the object storage, which if it's one of the hyperscalers, we've always got access to that. It also gives us the ability to leverage our own compression algorithm. So without going into the deep of this, while it's capturing on the way through the local repository and pushing it to object storage, which is being done in RAM, we're able to also compress and get a significant saving in terms of space when we're sending that up into object storage. And then from a recovery point of view, and for those not familiar with Veeam backup and replication and our specific requirements about being able to go in and restore from a granular point of view, individual mail items, individual files, SharePoint items, objects, etc. We have our Veeam Explorers. So within Veeam Backup for Office 365 today, we have the Exchange Explorer, we have the SharePoint Online Explorer, and we have the OneDrive Explorer. Those Exchange and SharePoint use exactly the same Explorers that we use for Veeam Backup and Replication, and they can be used either on that all-in-one box, or they could be installed elsewhere remotely on a client type configuration. Okay, so that's enough talking about slides. Let's one jump to, okay, so we're good?
Yeah, very quick question.
Yeah, sure.
When, so you showed about backing up to a specific cloud or location. Is it possible to do a transfer from one backup to other backup? And would you do that efficiently? For example, if I have a partnership with, let's say, IBM, and I get a cheaper cost, and then maybe 6 months down the road, I get a better deal with Microsoft or Amazon. So if I want to move everything into here, is that an easy option?
Yeah, good point. So we can extract that data and we can move that data from one. Obviously, that becomes a cost point. But where I said about the proxies having a link to the backup repository, they're generally on a yearly basis, or they've got their own limitations on how much data they can store as well. But you could just create another repository, which is ultimately just a folder, and then choose your next object storage. So we'll keep the retention in the object storage, like the IBM, because it's probably going to cost a lot more to bring it out and refactor it somewhere else. So we can pause it and then go to start sending that data to another location.
Do I have to do one at a time, or do you have a bulk option, bulk export import option?
I'm sure so I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's probably an option around being able to do that with PowerShell or RESTful API. So ultimately, this is that freshly built Windows 2019 machine. Now, it doesn't take very long, especially if you're using infrastructure code and all of the good stuff that's available out there to spin up machines from templates, etc., or even anything from a marketplace doesn't really take that long. So this machine gives us the base install of Veeam Backup for Office 365, and I'm just going to copy a PowerShell script here. Another thing that I'm going to tout, and I'm going to mention this next with a link as well with a QR code, is we have our own community edition, and something that is pretty much instilled in our DNA at Veeam is free products. The ability to offer a community edition, so being able to protect 10 users and up to 1 terabyte of SharePoint data using a free license. Obviously, you're going to have to pay for the marketplace, but you could roll your own 2019 server and install the community edition in your home lab and start to see what you've got. I know many people in the delegate panel probably have their own Office 365 demo lab, if you like, as well. So I don't want to install anything, but here you see that nothing is configured. We don't have any organizations, any backup infrastructure, apart from what's there from a default. So I want to run this, and hopefully, if all live demos go swimmingly well, I'll be able to and I'm not going to show that because there's some sensitive information in there. But what we should see as I'm talking now is the organization will be created. We're going to create 3 backup jobs. And that's not really the impressive part of this. Yes, it's highlighting that we've got PowerShell, we're flexible. Obviously, you could come in here, you could right click on there, you could go through the add organization, you could do all of that. You can enable the RESTful API all through our console, but this just shows that extensibility of being able to use PowerShell or RESTful API for that matter. So I've started 3 jobs. Yeah, that's open in the Swagger UI that I want to show as well. Good reminder. You'll see under backup infrastructure that I have my proxy. So again, we can add additional proxies here. Again, this is just an all-in-one server, so I'm not going to complicate, or I don't need that scale out for speed. Then we have our backup repository. So our backup repository consists of our local metadata and cache, but it also consists of our object storage. So by default, when that was first deployed, there would be a default backup repository in here, and that would just be using the local disk, the local C drive of this machine. Very much what you see there on the screen now. That next is where we offload the backup data to object storage, and we could also encrypt that data as we're sending it to object storage. Just to point out from a proxy point of view, everything that we pull down from office.com is also under SSL, so it's also encrypted for that matter. Then we have retention policy settings. So if we think about item level retention, snapshot based retention, it really depends on what your requirements are and how long you want to keep that for. But they do mean very different things. If again, Tim goes through a very good example of where and when to use this, but you could probably make out from the text there what it does and when do you want it to happen.
Hey, Michael, I have 2 questions. I'll try to make them quick. So the encryption key that's being used, where is that key being stored at the master key, and what level of control do you have over it? And the second one is, the previous demo had a cost estimator built in. Does this have cost estimation tools as well?
So the answer to the first one is I don't know. I'll try and find out and share that afterwards. The second question is no, and there is at least no plans for that in version 5, which is close. But that's another good. We're definitely looking at that cloud optimizations and how we better enable you or our customers to understand how much things are going to be costing. So yeah, good question. So just to look at the object storage as well. So you saw how I've attached that to the backup repository. If we go into here, again, very simple. We've chosen Amazon S3. I really wanted to show the flexibility in where we store that data. So in this instance, I'm running an Azure VM and I'm sending the data through Azure into Amazon S3, but there's flexibility in where you want or where you can store that, depending on where and what your deployment method is. Again, we add our S3 storage bucket and our credentials in there, location, bucket folder, etc. We can limit the storage consumption, and we can also leverage infrequent access from an S3 point of view as well. And then if we jump back up into the jobs, so again, for demo purposes, you could just come in here and you could create a job that is just the entire organization. But where would the fun be in that? So if I look at that backup job, look at an email test, for example, all I want to do is back up email for this particular organization, mail and archive. But you can see we could just have one job that has all of them ticked. If there are any accounts that you don't wish to protect, then we can add them in here. And that can be based on users groups or in particular sites from a SharePoint perspective. And then where do we want to back those up to? So which proxy do you want to use? And you'll see that the proxy is aligned to the backup repository. The proxy could also be aligned to multiple repositories. Ultimately, all of those 3 jobs look very similar. They've just got different tick boxes in what they want to protect. Then just to show you what those explorers look like, if you haven't seen them from a VBR point of view, then what we're going to do is we're going to mount that backup. We're going to see our inbox, and all of the spam that I send to this account will appear. So from here, we've got a couple of restore options. One, you've got the ability to advanced search and compare to production. So if someone doesn't know what they've deleted, but they know something's deleted, if that makes sense, then they can have that advanced search function. But also things like litigation hold and understanding, or e-discovery type tasks, we can understand if certain words were used, and we can start extracting that data. So there's a couple of options here. We can open that email here, and remember, this Explorer is running on that server, but it could be on a client machine as well. They're very low in terms of installation footprint. We can restore it back into the same user account. We can restore it to a different user account. We can export it to PST. We can save it to the desktop. We can send it to a different account. We can look at the properties of that. And again, just to quickly run through what it looks like from a OneDrive point of view, because we don't have this from a VBR perspective. So if we look here, again, we can send it directly back into OneDrive. I did a demo on YouTube on, well, how quickly can we recover if OneDrive was infected with ransomware. So a very quick way of being able to identify what's changed and get that data back up and running as fast as possible. The other thing to mention, and this is just so from a Swagger UI point of view, obviously we can come in here and you can test what is available for a RESTful API point of view. All of I'm going to call them the new Veeam products. So things that David just showed with Veeam Backup for AWS and Azure, things, so Veeam Backup for Office 365, and I know Anthony's also going to touch on this. We've had a real focus around API and exposing that API to do more with that, and we've got a great example of that coming up as well. So yeah, just jumping over to the version 5, just to show what this looks like. So obviously I have a Teams account here that I clearly was planned and knew exactly what I was going to talk about today. From a demo point of view, showing some files or some posts and some files within Microsoft Teams. There's a big invoice here for Stephen if he's still watching. But let's just simulate a very fast deletion of that data. Now, I understand that there is a recycle bin, and there are things around OneDrive for that immediate backup or for immediate recovery. But think about if we didn't see that invoice and it'd gone past the days in which the retention period was available from a Office 365 perspective. So if we jump into the V5 version, again, I'm using a different organization here, but you can see I've got a Teams backup. If we just quickly have a look through that, it's nothing really different in terms of we're saying we want to capture a Teams backup, which process, etc. What are we going to exclude? Where are we going to back it up to? When do you want to run it? So I think that's a point that I didn't potentially show in the other backup jobs, but it is there, is that we have the ability to be flexible around when you run this backup and how often you want that to run as well. But probably the most impressive bit is around the Veeam Explorer for Microsoft Teams. So again, we're going to mount that backup. And what we're going to see here is all of the groups or channels that we're associated to. And in particular, Cloud Field Day. So under here, we've got posts. So you can see let's hope I picked the right one. Big shout out to our Veeam Vanguards. And then under files, this is where we see that invoice. So we can open that here. So we can make sure that it's the right invoice. Few too many zeros. But we can also drop that back into the OneDrive if I can remember the password. Restore that. This takes a couple of seconds, but if I jump back into Teams, give that a refresh, and as if by magic, no, maybe another refresh. There we go. And our invoice is back in Microsoft Teams. And just remember, this is our V5. This is imminent from a release point of view, as Anthony touched on. Just to quickly jump back into the slides, I just want to give another shout out to some of the community efforts that have happened out there. So one is the community edition. That's that 10 free users. Another is the Grafana dashboard effort, the monumental effort that Jorge de la Cruz has gone to not only from an Office 365 point of view, but literally any Veeam product seems to be in there, and vSphere. Big shout out to that. Then down the bottom, you've got two, and one of them in which Anthony's going to cover more of. One is Project Martini. So if you're thinking about deploying multiple copies of VBO for maybe different regions, different users, different control reasons, environments, Project Martini leverages that Terraform capability of being able to deploy that and then manage that, a manager of managers, if you will. And then over to the self-service portal is more of a community-led project around giving the ability for our service providers, which Anthony's going to cover, giving more of a multi-tenanted approach to self-service for clients within that service provider world. And I think I'm just about on time. So if there are any questions, if not, I know we answered a few throughout, but yeah, we'll have a bit of a breakout afterwards to see that.